August 20th, 1939. The border between Mongolia and Manchuria. A 23-year-old Soviet officer named Georgy Zhukov looked across the empty steppe and made a decision that would change World War II before it even started. In front of him, 75,000 Japanese soldiers occupied fortified positions. Behind him, 57,000 Soviet and Mongolian troops waited for orders. Japan expected a frontal assault. They had prepared for weeks, dug trenches, built bunkers, positioned machine guns. Zhukov did not attack from the front. Instead, he executed a double envelopment, a pincer movement, encircling the entire Japanese force in 4 days. By August 23rd, the Japanese Sixth Army was destroyed, 23,000 killed, 25,000 wounded, and Japan learned a lesson that would reshape the entire Pacific War: never invade Russia. This is the story of Khalkin Gol, the forgotten battle that stopped Japan from attacking Siberia, the battle that forced Japan to turn south toward Pearl Harbor instead of north toward Moscow, the battle that made Georgy Zhukov the general who would later save Moscow, win Stalingrad, and take Berlin. And almost nobody knows it happened. To understand Khalkin Gol, you must understand the border between the Soviet Union and Japan in 1939. It was not a real border, not in any legal sense. The Soviet Union controlled Outer Mongolia, a vast territory of grassland and desert. Sparsely populated, strategically important only because it separated Soviet territory from Japanese-controlled Manchuria. Japan had conquered Manchuria in 1931. They renamed it Manchukuo, a puppet state ruled by the last emperor of China, but controlled entirely by the Japanese Kwantung Army. The border between Soviet Mongolia and Japanese Manchuria was poorly defined. Old maps disagreed. Some showed the border at the Khalkin Gol River. Others placed it 20 miles east. This ambiguity created constant friction. Japanese patrols crossed into territory the Soviets considered theirs. Soviet patrols did the same. Small clashes erupted regularly. A few soldiers killed. Both sides withdrew. No escalation. But in 1939, Japan decided to test Soviet resolve. The Japanese military was divided into 2 factions. The Imperial Japanese Army favored expansion north into Siberia, rich resources, weak Soviet presence in the Far East, easy conquest. The Imperial Japanese Navy favored expansion south into Southeast Asia. Oil, rubber, resources Japan desperately needed. But this meant war with Britain, America, and the Netherlands. The army faction was dominant in 1939, and they believed the Soviet Union was weak. Stalin's Great Purge had gutted the Red Army Officer Corps. Between 1936 and 1938, 30,000 officers were arrested. 15,000 were executed. The rest sent to gulags. The purge destroyed institutional knowledge. Experienced commanders were gone, replaced by inexperienced loyalists promoted for political reliability, not military competence. Japan watched this carefully. They concluded the Red Army was broken, incapable of serious resistance. In May 1939, Japanese forces from Manchuria crossed the Khalkin Gol River into Soviet-controlled Mongolia. It started small. A reconnaissance unit. Testing defenses. Soviet and Mongolian border guards engaged them. The Japanese withdrew. 2 days later, a larger Japanese force crossed, this time with armor support. Type 95 light tanks. Soviet forces engaged again. Both sides took casualties. The Japanese withdrew again, but they did not stop. Throughout May and June, Japanese forces made repeated incursions, each one slightly larger, each one pushing deeper into Mongolian territory. The Soviet Union protested diplomatically. Japan ignored the protests. By July, The Japanese Sixth Army had committed nearly 75,000 troops to the border. They built fortified positions on the west side of the Khalkin Gol River. Soviet territory. A clear invasion. Moscow had a decision to make. Retreat and lose Mongolia. Or fight and risk full-scale war with Japan. Stalin chose to fight, but he needed a commander capable of winning. He chose Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov. Zhukov was 42 years old in 1939, the son of a shoemaker. No formal education. He had joined the Imperial Russian Army in World War I as a private. Rose through the ranks. After the Russian Revolution, he joined the Red Army. He survived the purges by staying out of politics, focusing entirely on military competence. By 1939, he commanded the 57th Special Corps, a mechanized force based in Mongolia. Stalin gave him direct orders. Stop the Japanese. Use whatever force necessary. Do not lose. Zhukov traveled to the front in June 1939. He studied the terrain. He studied Japanese tactics. And he developed a plan. The Japanese expected a frontal assault. Standard Soviet doctrine. Mass infantry attacks. Human wave tactics. High casualties, but eventual breakthrough through sheer numbers. Zhukov knew this would fail. The Japanese were dug in. Machine guns covered all approaches. A frontal assault would be slaughtered. Instead, Zhukov planned something the Red Army had never attempted before. A modern combined arms offensive. Armor. Infantry, artillery, air support, all coordinated. But first, he needed to build up his forces without the Japanese noticing. Throughout July and early August, Soviet forces poured into Mongolia. Tanks, artillery, aircraft, supplies. All movement happened at night. All vehicles were camouflaged during the day. Strict radio silence, no fires, no lights. The Japanese knew Soviet reinforcements were arriving, but they drastically underestimated the numbers. Japanese intelligence estimated Zhukov had 35,000 troops and 200 tanks. The actual numbers were 57,000 troops and 498 tanks, plus 545 aircraft. By mid-August, Zhukov was ready. His plan was simple in concept, complex in execution. He would launch a double envelopment, a pincer attack, striking both flanks of the Japanese line simultaneously. Encircling the entire Sixth Army, the Japanese would be cut off, surrounded, unable to retreat, unable to resupply. Then Soviet forces would destroy them systematically. It was the same tactic Hannibal used at Cannae in 216 BC. The same tactic that would later destroy German armies at Stalingrad and Kursk. But in 1939, the Red Army had never executed a large-scale encirclement. This would be the first. On August 20th, 1939, at 5:45 in the morning, Zhukov gave the order. 150 Soviet artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The barrage lasted 3 hours. Targeting Japanese command posts, artillery positions, communication lines. Japanese commanders tried to coordinate a defense, but their telephone lines were cut. Radio stations destroyed. Runners could not get through the artillery fire. At 8:45, the artillery shifted targets, now targeting the front-line trenches. Soviet infantry and armor advanced, but this was not the main attack. This was a feint. A distraction. The real assault came from the flanks. On the northern flank, Lieutenant General Mikhail Bogdanov commanded the Northern Armored Group. 150 tanks, mostly BT-7 fast tanks, supported by motorized infantry. On the southern flank, Lieutenant General Yakovlev commanded the Southern Armored Group. 130 tanks. Same composition. Both groups had been positioned in concealed staging areas, hidden behind ridge lines, covered with camouflage netting. The Japanese did not know they were there. At 9 o'clock, both armored groups launched their attacks. The northern group smashed through the Japanese left flank. The Japanese had minimal forces there. They expected the main attack from the front. The Soviet tanks broke through in 40 minutes. The southern group faced stronger resistance. The Japanese right flank had more troops, better positions, but Soviet air support made the difference. IL-16 fighters and SB-2 bombers attacked Japanese positions continuously, dropping bombs, strafing trenches. The Japanese had no air cover. Their nearest airfields were in Manchuria, too far to provide support. By noon, both Soviet armored groups had broken through. They began turning inward, toward each other, closing the trap. Japanese commanders realized what was happening. They sent urgent messages to Kwantung Army headquarters in Manchuria. Request reinforcements, request air support, request permission to retreat. The Kwantung Army sent one infantry division. The 7th, 25,000 men. But they arrived too late. By August 22nd, the Soviet pincer had closed. The Japanese 6th Army was surrounded. 75,000 men. Cut off from supply, cut off from reinforcement. The 7th Division tried to break through the Soviet encirclement from the east. They attacked with everything they had. Soviet forces stopped them cold. Artillery devastated their formations. Tanks counterattacked. The 7th Division suffered 40% casualties in 2 days. They withdrew. Inside the encirclement, the 6th Army was dying. Soviet artillery fired continuously. 24 hours a day. Shells rained down on Japanese positions. Soviet aircraft bombed during daylight, strafed anything that moved. Soviet tanks prowled the perimeter, crushing any attempt to break out. Food ran out on August 24th. Water ran out on August 25th. Japanese soldiers tried to escape at night. Small groups, running through Soviet lines. Most were killed. Some made it to Manchuria. Dozens of miles on foot. No food. No water. Many died in the desert. By August 28th, organized resistance collapsed. Soviet forces moved in to clear remaining pockets. House-to-house fighting. Or in this case, trench to trench. Japanese soldiers fought with desperate courage. No surrender. Death before dishonor. Soviet troops showed little mercy. This was total war. By August 31st, it was over. The Japanese 6th Army ceased to exist. 23,000 killed. 25,000 wounded. 500 captured. Soviet losses were substantial. 9,000 killed. 15,000 wounded. But strategically, the victory was total. Japan had been humiliated. Their elite Kwantung Army defeated. Their modern tanks destroyed by superior Soviet armor. Their infantry tactics proven obsolete. The political fallout in Tokyo was immediate. The cabinet fell. Prime Minister Hiranuma resigned. The government was in crisis. More importantly, the army faction lost credibility. Their strategy of northern expansion into Siberia was discredited. If Japan could not defeat the Soviet Union in Mongolia with local superiority, how could they conquer Siberia? The answer was clear. They could not. The Navy faction seized the opportunity. They argued for southern expansion, into Southeast Asia, away from the Soviet Union. This strategic shift had enormous consequences. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Japan did not join the attack. If they had, Moscow would have faced a two-front war. German armies from the west, Japanese armies from the east. The Soviet Union might have collapsed, but Japan remembered Khalkin Gol. They remembered Zhukov. They wanted no part of another war with Russia. Instead, Japan went south. They invaded French Indochina, then British Malaya, then the Dutch East Indies. And on December 7, 1941, They attacked Pearl Harbor. The entire Pacific War happened because Japan chose not to fight Russia. And they chose not to fight Russia because of what happened at Khalkin Gol in August 1939. For Georgy Zhukov, the victory was career-defining. Stalin promoted him to general and gave him command of the Kiev military district, one of the most important commands in the Soviet Union. When Germany invaded in June 1941, Zhukov was deputy chief of the Soviet General Staff. Throughout the war, Stalin relied on Zhukov more than any other general. Zhukov saved Moscow in December 1941, using the same tactics he developed at Khalkin Gol: counterattack, encirclement, destroy the enemy force. He commanded the counteroffensive at Stalingrad in November 1942, again using encirclement. Operation Uranus. The same basic plan as Khalkin Gol, just much larger. He planned the defense at Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history. Soviet forces absorbed the German attack, then counterattacked, encircled, destroyed. And in April 1945, Zhukov led the final assault on Berlin. Every major Soviet victory of World War II bore Zhukov's stamp, and the foundation of his tactical thinking was laid at Khalkin Gol. But the battle's strategic importance goes beyond Zhukov's career. It fundamentally altered the course of World War II in ways that are still underappreciated. Consider the counterfactual. What if Japan had won at Khalkin Gol? If the Red Army had been defeated, Japan's army faction would have remained dominant. Northern expansion would have continued. In June 1941, when Germany invaded Russia, Japan would almost certainly have invaded Siberia. The Soviet Union would have faced armies from both directions. Germany in the west, Japan in the east. The Siberian divisions that saved Moscow in December 1941 would not have been available. Those 40 divisions were transferred from the Far East only because Japan was not a threat. Without those divisions, Moscow likely falls. Without Moscow, the Soviet Union might collapse, or at minimum be pushed beyond the Urals. Germany would control European Russia, all its resources, all its industry, all its people. The war in Europe would be unwinnable for the Allies. This is not wild speculation. German planners explicitly hoped for Japanese intervention in Siberia. Hitler repeatedly urged Japan to attack Russia, not America. But Japan refused. Because of Khalkin Gol. One battle in Mongolia in August 1939 prevented a Japanese invasion of Siberia in 1941. That decision allowed the Soviet Union to survive. And the Soviet Union's survival meant Germany's defeat. The chain of causation is direct. Yet Khalkin Gol remains almost unknown in the West. Ask 100 Americans what happened in August 1939. 95 will say the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Germany and Russia dividing Poland. Maybe 5 will mention Khalkin Gol. Even among military historians, the battle receives minimal attention. Most World War II histories mention it in a footnote, if at all. Why? Partly because it happened before the war officially started. September 1st is when World War II begins in Western narratives. August 1939 is pre-war, partly because it happened far from Europe and America. Mongolia might as well be another planet for Western audiences in 1939, partly because the Soviet Union did not publicize it heavily. Stalin wanted to avoid provoking Japan further. The last thing he needed in 1941 was a war with Japan and Germany simultaneously, and partly because Japan lost. Defeated nations do not celebrate their defeats. Japanese histories minimize Khalkin Gol, treat it as a minor border incident. But it was not minor. It was decisive. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russian military archives opened. Historians gained access to detailed records of the battle. What they found confirmed Zhukov's tactical brilliance, his planning, his deception, his execution. The operation was studied by military academies worldwide. The pincer movement, the combined arms coordination, the use of armor. Modern doctrine traces directly to Khalkin Gol. In 1999, on the 60th anniversary of the battle, Mongolia erected a monument at the battlefield. A tall stone pillar, inscribed in Mongolian and Russian. Veterans attended. Soviet veterans who were still alive. Mongolian veterans. They were old men by then, in their 80s and 90s. Russian television recorded the ceremony. The veterans spoke about the battle, about Zhukov, about what they had witnessed. One veteran, Ivan Shevchenko, had been a tank commander, BT-7 tank, Northern Armored Group. He described the attack, racing across the steppe, Japanese machine guns firing, shells exploding, his tank taking hits but continuing forward. When he broke through the Japanese line, he said he understood this was something new, something the Red Army had never done before. We were fighting like Germans, he said. Blitzkrieg. But we were doing it first. Another veteran, Bata Dorj, had been a Mongolian cavalry scout. He described watching the Japanese encirclement close, seeing the trapped enemy, knowing they could not escape. This was when we knew we could win, he said. Not just this battle, the whole war. If we could do this, we could beat anyone. These men understood, even in 1939, that they had witnessed something historically significant. But the world forgot. Today, the battlefield at Khalkin Gol is empty. Grassland, desert, quiet. The trenches are still visible if you know where to look. Shallow depressions in the earth. Occasionally, locals find artifacts. Shell casings, pieces of tanks, bones. The Mongolian government has proposed making it a historical site. But funding is limited. Mongolia is poor. Preservation is expensive. So the battlefield sits, slowly eroding, slowly disappearing. Which is a shame, because this place changed the world. If you understand Khalkin Gol, you understand why the Pacific War happened. You understand why Moscow did not fall. You understand why Zhukov became the Soviet Union's greatest general. You understand the origins of modern combined arms warfare. One battle, 4 days, August 1939. Before World War II officially started, a 23-year-old Soviet officer proved that encirclement and mechanized warfare could defeat a modern army. The Japanese learned not to invade Russia. Zhukov learned how to win wars, and the entire strategic balance of World War II shifted, right there, on the Mongolian steppe, without a single Western observer present. If this story of forgotten history and strategic consequences resonated with you, please subscribe. There are dozens of battles like this, conflicts that shaped World War II but remain unknown. The China-Burma-India theater, Soviet-Japanese conflicts, battles in Africa, the Balkans, the Pacific Islands. These stories matter. The men who fought them deserve to be remembered. The lessons they teach are still relevant. Where are you watching from? Did you know about Khalkin Gol before this video? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for watching. Thank you for learning. And thank you for helping preserve the memory of a battle the world forgot.